Think about what happens when a modern admiral wants an entire fleet to change course. A message leaves the flagship. Within seconds, ships miles away can receive the order by radio or data link. Commanders can report their positions. Aircraft and helicopters can relay information. Every vessel can remain widely separated and still belong to the same command network. Now remove the wireless radio, no voice transmission, no Morse code sent invisibly through the air, no secure data link, no way to speak to a ship once it disappeared beyond the horizon. Before 1900, an admiral commanding a fleet faced a problem that seems almost impossible today. His ships could spread across miles of ocean, wind, smoke, fog, darkness, and battle could separate them. Yet he still had to tell dozens of captains when to turn, when to chase, when to form a line, when to attack, when to withdraw, and where to meet if the fleet became scattered. So how did he control them? The answer was not one device. It was an entire language built from flags, pennants, lanterns, guns, signal books, repeating ships, prearranged formations, written orders, and captains trained to understand what the admiral wanted even when no new message could reach them. And that last part was the most important. Before wireless, naval command depended less on constant conversation and more on preparation. An admiral could send signals while ships remained within sight. After that, every captain might be on his own. The fleet therefore had to carry the commander's intent inside its formation, its standing orders, its signal books, and the judgment of individual officers. Communication was visible. A message had to be seen. If the horizon hid the flagship, the admiral effectively disappeared. To understand how navies solve this problem, begin with the oldest signal aboard a warship, the flag. Flags had been used at sea for centuries. At the simplest level, they identified nationality, rank, and status. An admiral's flag told other ships where the commander was. A national ensign showed allegiance. Special flags could indicate distress, quarantine, a pilot request, or other conditions. But fleets needed more than identification. They needed language. By the age of sail, European navies developed increasingly elaborate systems in which combinations of flags represented specific instructions. Instead of spelling every word, a group of flags could correspond to an entry in a signal book. One combination might mean form line of battle, another might mean chase the enemy, another could order a particular division to alter course. The flags were not the message by themselves. They were a code pointing to a meaning everyone had agreed upon in advance. This made signaling much faster. Imagine trying to spell a long tactical instruction one letter at a time while 20 ships rolled in heavy seas, a coded signal. Reduced a complicated sentence to a small number of visible symbols. The flagship hoisted the correct flags. Other ships watched. Signal officers consulted their books. The meaning was passed to the captain. Then the receiving ship acknowledged the order, often by displaying a corresponding signal. Only after the admiral knew the fleet had seen it could the flags be hauled down. That final step mattered. Lowering a signal could indicate that the order was now to be carried out. The system created a rhythm. Hoist, observe, interpret, acknowledge, execute. In calm weather with ships close together, it could work remarkably well. But every part of the process depended on vision. The flagship had to be visible. The flags had to be distinguishable. The receiving officer had to notice them. The wind had to open the cloth enough for the pattern to be recognized. Smoke could not cover the mast. Rain could not reduce visibility too severely, and the fleet could not be spread so widely that the farthest ships could no longer make out the signal. This was why fleets sometimes used repeating ships. A vessel positioned where it could see both the flagship and more distant ships could repeat the admiral's signal. Then another ship might repeat it again. The message traveled across the formation by sight. In effect, the fleet created a human optical network. Each ship was a relay station. But relays introduced delay and error. A signal could be misread. A repeater could hoist the wrong flag. A distant ship might see the repeating vessel but not know whether the signal originated from the admiral. A command intended for one division might appear to apply to another, and once battle began, masts and rigging were among the first things gunfire could damage. The very structures carrying the fleet's communication system could be shot away. That meant signaling was not an accessory to naval warfare. It was part of the fighting capability of the ship. Destroy the enemy's ability to see and repeat orders, and his fleet could become less coordinated even if most of his guns still worked. Signal books became increasingly sophisticated because admirals needed to express more complicated ideas. One of the most important British developments around the beginning of the 19th century was the numerical signal system associated with Captain Sir Home Popham. Instead of needing a unique flag for every phrase, combinations of numbered flags could refer to words and instructions listed in a vocabulary. This allowed fleets to communicate far more flexibly. The most famous example occurred on October 21st, 1805, just before the Battle of Trafalgar. Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson ordered a signal from HMS Victory that would become one of the most famous messages in naval history. England expects that every man will do his duty. The message was sent by signal flags using Popham's code, but the famous sentence can hide what naval signaling was really for. Nelson did not expect to control Trafalgar by continuously sending inspirational phrases from his mast. The critical tactical work had already happened before the first major shots were fired. Nelson had explained his plan to his captains. He intended to attack the combined French and Spanish fleet in columns, break through its line, and create a close-range battle in which British gunnery and aggression could dominate. His captains knew the general intention. That mattered because once the fleets entered battle, smoke and chaos would make detailed control extremely difficult. Nelson could signal before contact. He could influence the opening movements. But after ships collided with the enemy line, captains had to fight independently. This is the deeper reason Trafalgar is such a useful example of naval command before radio. The famous signal was visible. Nelson's real command system was largely invisible. It existed in the minds of his captains. He had spent time creating confidence, shared expectations, and a common understanding of how he wanted the battle fought. That allowed the fleet to continue functioning when signals became difficult or impossible. In modern language, we might describe this as commander's intent. The subordinate understands the objective well enough to act without asking for constant permission. Before wireless, that was not simply a leadership preference. It was a technical necessity. The horizon imposed independence. A captain could not call the flagship and ask what to do. If he became separated, he had his last orders, his knowledge of naval doctrine, and his judgment. This shaped fleet tactics. During the sailing era, fleets often fought in line ahead, with each ship following the one before it. The formation made command easier. A line could copy the movements of the flagship. If the leader turned, the ships behind could turn at the same point. If an order applied to everyone, one signal could direct the formation. The line also suited broadside gunnery, allowing ships to bring their guns to bear without masking one another. But the same formation could become rigid. A long line took time to respond. Signals might reach the rear slowly. Ships differed in speed and handling. Wind affected each vessel differently. A damaged ship could create a gap. If a captain misunderstood an order, ships behind him might copy the mistake. Fleet maneuver was therefore partly an exercise in choreography. Captains trained to maintain station. They watched the ships around them. They understood standard maneuvers. An admiral did not need to explain every turn from first principles because the fleet had practiced the movement before battle. This is another central feature of command without radio. Doctrine replaced conversation. The more predictable and standardized a maneuver became, the less information had to be transmitted while it was happening. A simple flag could trigger a complicated action because every captain already knew the procedure. But fleets did not always remain compact. Scouting created one of the hardest problems. An admiral needed to find the enemy before he could fight him. Frigates, cruisers, and other fast ships could be sent ahead or to the sides to search. But once a scout disappeared over the horizon, it was disconnected. If it found the enemy, it could not simply report by wireless. It had to return within visual range, send a boat, or use another chain of visual signals if intermediate ships had been positioned. This imposed a hard limit on how far scouting forces could operate while remaining under immediate control. A scout that traveled farther gained more coverage. It also increased the time required for information to return. Suppose a frigate sailed 20 miles ahead and discovered the enemy. It now had to reverse course, or send information through another ship. During that delay, the enemy might move. By the time the admiral received the report, it was already old. Naval commanders therefore worked with positions that were always becoming obsolete. The sea made this worse because there were no roads forcing fleets along fixed paths. An enemy could turn almost anywhere, lose visual contact, and even a large fleet could disappear. Admirals compensated with prediction. They studied wind, geography, known destinations, previous sightings, intelligence from ports, merchant ships, and expected enemy objectives. They placed scouts where the enemy was most likely to appear. Then they created rendezvous instructions. If ships became separated, they needed to know where to go. A fleet might designate a latitude and longitude, a recognizable headland, a harbor entrance, or a planned cruising area. This was control through future agreement. The admiral could not communicate with a detached squadron, so he told it beforehand where to be at a certain time. If the situation changed, the plan could fail. But without wireless, there was no alternative. Written orders, therefore, mattered enormously. Before a fleet sailed, captains could receive detailed instructions covering routes, formations, signals, contingencies, and rendezvous points. An admiral might specify what to do if the enemy appeared from a certain direction, what course to steer at night, which ships formed each division, and where detached vessels should rejoin. These orders stored decisions in advance. Every contingency that could be anticipated reduced the need for communication later. Of course, war exists partly to destroy anticipation. Wind changes. The enemy does something unexpected. A mast falls, fog closes in, ships lose contact. That is where initiative became essential. But initiative created its own danger. If every captain interpreted the situation differently, the fleet could dissolve into independent actions. The art of command lay between rigidity and freedom. An admiral needed captains obedient enough to act as one fleet, but independent enough to continue when signals failed. Nelson became famous partly because he cultivated this balance. His captains knew what he generally wanted. They could therefore act aggressively without waiting for a flag signal that might never come. Not every navy achieved that level of cohesion. Poorly trained fleets could become dependent on formal signals. Captains might hesitate when orders were unclear. Different languages, doctrines, and levels of experience could complicate Allied fleets. At Trafalgar, the French and Spanish fleet contained brave and capable officers, but the combined force had less opportunity to develop the same degree of shared practice as Nelson's British captains. Communication was only one factor in the outcome, but command cohesion mattered. And once gunfire began, visual signaling became much harder. A sailing warship produced smoke even before battle, but dozens of ships firing black powder cannon could create enormous clouds. Gun smoke drifted between vessels. Masts disappeared. Flags became difficult to see. The flagship itself might be hidden. A signal officer could know that an order had been hoisted and still have no idea whether the intended ship saw it. Ships could also fly many flags at once. National colors, rank flags, identification signals, and tactical messages all competed for attention. Damage added confusion. A halyard could be shot away. A flag might fall. A mast could collapse. The flagship might transfer command if the admiral were killed or disabled. Then every captain had to determine where authority had moved. This explains why admirals sometimes placed enormous importance on keeping their flag visible. The flag did more than identify a ship. It told the fleet where command physically existed. No wireless network separated the commander from the flagship. The commander was where his flag was. If the flag disappeared, uncertainty spread. Sound offered another way to communicate. Guns could be fired as signals. A particular number of shots might call attention, mark a time, signal an emergency, or accompany other instructions. Ships used bells aboard for timekeeping and routine activity, and drums, whistles, trumpets, or bugles could control men locally. But sound over open water had limits. Wind carried noise unpredictably. Battle drowned signals beneath cannon fire. A gunshot could communicate that something had happened, but it could not carry detailed tactical language, unless everyone already knew what the sound meant. Again, prearrangement was the key. The simpler the signal, the more reliable it could be. One shot can mean look at the flagship. A series can mean recall boats, but a gun cannot easily explain a complicated maneuver. At night, flags became almost useless. Navies therefore developed systems using lanterns, rockets, flares, and later more sophisticated flashing lights. The challenge was the same as during daylight, except harder. A lamp had to be visible, but not ambiguous. Different arrangements of lights could represent numbers or predetermined meanings. A ship might display lanterns at particular points on the rigging. Rockets could transmit simple signals across greater distances. By the 19th century, improved night signaling systems allowed combinations of lights or flashes to represent coded information. The Royal Navy introduced important improvements during the 1860s, including systems associated with Philip Column. Column's night signaling used flashes that could represent numbers and therefore connect with coded signal books. This was a major improvement because it extended structured communication into darkness. But night signals still depended on line of sight. Fog could erase them. Rain reduced range. Bright moonlight or shore lights could make interpretation harder. An enemy could observe them, and displaying a light revealed that a ship was present. This created a military contradiction that would remain even after radio arrived. Communication helps your own forces. It may also help the enemy find you. Before wireless, the trade-off was literal. To send a light signal, you had to shine a light. To send flags, you had to place them where they could be seen. In peacetime exercises, this was manageable. In war, every visible signal carried risk. The arrival of steam power made fleet command both easier and harder. Sailing fleets depended on wind. A signal to alter course might be impossible for one ship to execute exactly as ordered because the wind did not permit it. Different sailing qualities stretched formations. Steam engines gave warships far more freedom to choose course and speed. An admiral could expect ships to maneuver more precisely, but steam also increased the scale and speed of naval operations. By the late 19th century, fleets contained ironclads, battleships, cruisers, torpedo boats, and other specialized vessels moving at very different speeds. Engagement ranges increased, scouts could travel farther, formations became more dispersed, a commander gained more powerful ships while the old visual communication system still depended on keeping them within sight. The problem became increasingly obvious. A modern steam fleet could move beyond the practical limits of flags faster than an age-of-sail fleet ever could. An admiral might want cruisers tens of miles away searching for the enemy, but if they were tens of miles away, he could not talk to them. The fleet had developed long-range weapons and high-speed scouts without developing long-range communication. That mismatch shaped late 19th century naval thinking. Signal systems became increasingly elaborate. Navies standardized flags and numerical codes. The international commercials. Code of signals, introduced in the mid-19th century, helped ships of different nations communicate basic information. Naval codes remained more complex because warships needed tactical instructions that merchant vessels did not. Semaphore also offered a rapid visual method at shorter ranges. A signalman used flags held in different positions to represent letters or characters. With trained operators, messages could be transmitted quickly between nearby ships. But semaphore required the receiving ship to see the signalman's body and flags clearly. That made it useful at relatively close range, not across an ocean. Signal lamps eventually allowed Morse code or other coded flashes to carry written language at night and over useful visual distances. All of these methods improved the old system. None solved the horizon. That was the absolute barrier. From a masthead, a lookout could see farther than a man on deck, but the curvature of the earth still limited visibility. Once another ship passed beyond that line, no larger flag or brighter daytime signal could reach it. Command ended at the horizon. This is difficult to appreciate today because modern naval operations assume communication beyond sight. A destroyer can be hundreds of miles from an admiral and still receive orders. Before wireless, a detached force became almost autonomous. It could operate according to instructions, but headquarters could not continuously update those instructions. This meant strategic command moved much more slowly than tactical command. A government in London could send orders by telegraph cable to a naval base overseas. That was revolutionary. By the late 19th century, undersea telegraph cables connected major parts of the world. An admiral in port could receive instructions from home far faster than his predecessors. But the cable ended on land. Once the fleet sailed, the connection stopped. A ship had to return to port, encounter a dispatch vessel, or receive orders through some other physical means. This produced an odd communications world. London could sometimes send a message thousands of miles to a colonial station faster than an admiral could send the same message 20 miles to a cruiser beyond his horizon. The global telegraph network had conquered distance on land and under the sea. The final gap was between the shore and the moving ship. Navies used dispatch vessels to bridge that gap. A fast ship could carry written orders from one location to another. This was essentially the runner system of a land army placed on water. The dispatch vessel was itself the message carrier. It had to locate the recipient. Weather, enemy action, navigation error, and distance all created delay. But for information too complex for visual signals or forces too distant to see, physical delivery remained necessary. An admiral commanding a blockade or scattered squadron, therefore, relied heavily on schedules and geography. Ships were assigned patrol areas. They knew where to report. They knew when to return for coal, supplies, or instructions. A cruiser might be ordered to watch one route for a certain number of days and then rendezvous at a specific point. The system worked because everyone followed the timetable. If a ship failed to appear, the admiral did not immediately know why. Mechanical failure, bad weather, enemy contact, capture. The absence itself was the only information. This is one reason pre-wireless naval operations often seem slow and deliberate. Commanders could not casually scatter ships across vast areas and expect to gather them again instantly. Every detachment created a communications problem. Every scouting mission risked losing contact. Every change of plan required finding the ships affected by it. The fleet was not just a collection of combat vessels. It was a formation constrained by the distance over which human beings could exchange information. Battle made the constraint brutal. Imagine standing on the bridge of a 19th century battleship. The admiral's flagship is somewhere ahead. Smoke drifts across the sea. Your signal officer reports flags at the flagship's mast, but another ship blocks part of the view. The flags disappear behind smoke. Someone thinks the signal means turn, together. Another officer believes it means turn in succession. You check the signal book. Then the flagship vanishes completely. Do you wait? Do you copy the ship ahead? Do you execute the last signal you understood? Meanwhile, the enemy is moving. This was not rare incompetence. It was the natural consequence of trying to control moving machines with optical communication. Admirals reduced that uncertainty through exercises. Peacetime fleet maneuvers were not simply displays. They tested whether ships could maintain formation, interpret signals, turn together, scout, concentrate, and respond to unexpected situations. A navy that practiced frequently could execute complicated movements with fewer signals. Officers learned one another's habits. Signal crews became faster. Captains understood doctrine. Just as importantly, exercises exposed the limits of the system. The larger and faster fleets became, the more obvious it was that visual signaling could not support every mission commanders wanted to perform. Then, in the final years of the 19th century, something fundamentally different appeared: wireless telegraphy. Guglielmo Marconi and other experimenters showed that electrical signals could be transmitted through the air without a connecting wire. At first, the distances were modest, the equipment was experimental. Interference was a problem. Messages were sent as telegraphic signals rather than ordinary voice conversations. But to a navy, the implication was enormous. For the first time, a ship might communicate with another ship it could not see. The horizon was no longer an absolute communications wall. Marconi demonstrated rapidly increasing ranges during the late 1890s. In 1899, his system was tested aboard British warships during naval maneuvers. 3 ships of the Channel Squadron carried wireless equipment, and reports from the period described successful communication over distances reaching far beyond normal visual signaling. The United States Navy was watching closely. Later that year, American naval officers observed Marconi equipment during the international yacht races and conducted experiments with naval vessels. The technology was still young, but the strategic importance was already clear. A cruiser, scouting beyond the horizon, could potentially report what it had seen without sailing back to the fleet. An admiral could alter orders after ships had separated. A blockade could cover a wider area because vessels no longer needed to remain within visual distance, simply to exchange information. A shore station connected to telegraph networks could pass instructions to ships at sea. This did not happen overnight. Early wireless sets were bulky, range varied. Interference could make signals difficult to distinguish. Transmitters could overlap. Operators needed training. Messages could be intercepted by anyone with suitable equipment. Encryption and radio discipline would become increasingly important. And wireless telegraphy did not initially mean an admiral, speaking directly to every captain. The early naval radio operator worked with coded telegraphic signals. There were still delays. There were still procedures. Flags and signal lamps remained important for tactical communication, especially when ships were close together. But the fundamental geometry of command had changed. Before wireless, communication depended on a chain of visibility. After wireless, communication could cross empty water. The commander no longer needed every ship to see the flagship. That opened the way to a new kind of fleet. Scouts could operate farther away. Squadrons could spread over larger areas. Ships could report enemy sightings from beyond the horizon. Naval bases could communicate with forces at sea. Strategic intelligence could reach commanders before they returned to port. A fleet could begin to function as a network rather than only as a visible formation. This transformation would become critical in the 20th century. By World War I, wireless communication had become a central part of naval operations. It allowed fleets to coordinate across much greater distances. It also created new vulnerabilities. Every transmission could be intercepted. Radio direction finding could help locate a transmitter. Traffic patterns could reveal that a fleet was moving, even when messages remained encrypted. The same technology that expanded, command also expanded the enemy's ability to listen. That is a pattern repeated throughout military history. Every solution creates another problem. Flags were secure in one sense because they disappeared beyond the horizon. But that was also their weakness. Wireless crossed the horizon. But so could an enemy receiver. Before 1900, admirals did not possess that choice. They controlled fleets by designing systems that assumed communication would fail. That is the detail modern technology makes easy to forget. The pre-wireless Navy was not constantly improvising because nobody had invented radio yet. It was deliberately organized around limited communication. Formations kept ships mutually visible. Signal books compressed complicated instructions into a few flags. Repeating ships extended those signals across the fleet. Night codes used lamps, rockets, and flashes. Written orders established plans before sailing. Rendezvous points allowed separated ships to find one another again. Doctrine told captains how to behave when signals disappeared. And commanders selected officers they trusted to continue the plan without supervision. The technology shaped the culture. A captain expected independence because independence might be forced upon him at any moment. Once the flagship vanished into fog, there was no button to press. Once a scout crossed the horizon, the admiral could no longer change its mission. Once battle smoke covered the masts, the fleet's carefully designed visual network began breaking into individual ships. Command survived only if the plan had been understood before communication disappeared. This is why the famous flag signals of naval history mattered, but also why they can mislead us. They create the impression that admirals controlled battles by continuously hoisting commands. In reality, the best commanders knew there was a limit to how much flags could accomplish once fighting began. A signal could begin a maneuver. It could clarify an intention. It could call attention to an opportunity. But a flag could not micromanage 20 ships through smoke and cannon fire. The most effective fleet was therefore one in which captains did not require constant signaling. Nelson's achievement at Trafalgar was not that victory possessed better flags than everyone else. It was that his fleet entered battle with a strong, shared understanding of how he wanted it fought. The signal system carried orders. Leadership carried intent. And when the signal system began to disappear behind smoke, intent remained. So the next time you see an old painting of a fleet with dozens of colored flags hanging from the masts, do not think of them as decoration. Those flags were the communications network. A piece of cloth could tell a squadron to turn. A pennant could identify the commander. A repeated hoist could carry an order from ship to ship. A lantern could become language after sunset. A gun could call attention when visibility failed. And a captain's memory could carry the plan after every signal disappeared. Before wireless radio, an admiral controlled only what he could reach through sight, sound, preparation, or a physically delivered message. Beyond that boundary, command became trust. Trust that the signal had been understood. Trust that the captain remembered his orders. Trust that the scout would return. Trust that the rendezvous point would still make sense. Trust that the fleet could continue behaving like one organization even when its ships could no longer communicate. That was naval command before wireless. Not silence, not chaos. A carefully engineered system built around the assumption that the sea would eventually separate the commander from the people he commanded. And then, in the closing years of the 19th century, wireless telegraphy crossed the one barrier flags could never defeat: the horizon. If this story changed the way you imagine warfare before modern technology, subscribe to Before Modern War. We examine how armies and navies communicated, navigated, found the enemy, survived, and fought before electronic systems transformed the battlefield.